Okay, hello everyone. This is my kind of reflections on the Baburnama. It's sort of one of those books. It's hard to, or it seems like it would be a disservice to do a review of it, like it's sort of a piece of entertainment. Um, Although it is a very entertaining book. But the Baburnama, in the original title called the Vakia of Babur, who was the uh, sort of known as the founder of the Mughal dynasty that came to rule India in the 16th century. Um, this is his memoir, and a lot is written about it. A lot can be still probably written about it and written about Babur. Um, and I read it again. This is, I think, my third time, and I have previously read this translation by Wheeler Thaxton once before, and the other translation, the original translation from in terms of modern work on it, it was done by Annette Beveridge in the late 19th, early 20th century from the Chagatai text. And when I read the Baburnama this time, I kind of was thinking about it as sort of a very serious monument, not so much of South Asian history, but of Central Asian history. In a lot of ways, Babur is kind of the last Timurid, although his descendants did, call themselves Timurids. They were, part of the Timurid lineage. But to me, he was kind of the last Timurid in the sense of the last prince that was trying in Central Asia and Iran to kind of revive that high imperial culture that Tamerlane tried to begin, although I think his proclivities sort of prevented that from happening. He was a major world conqueror kind of person, uh, wreaked a lot of havoc. I don't think the kind of stories are entirely exaggerated, in terms of the destruction he caused. I think that's fairly accurate. But reading the Baburnama this time for me, I noticed, Babur, if you read his narrative carefully, he does kind of show you some of these ideas were that maybe can be in scholarship but are more popular about these steppe empires are not really true, or are highly exaggerated and romanticized often. And I mean, a lot of things in history end up like that. And what do I mean? Babur, who is as the kind of last Timurid, not literally last, but maybe I'm being a little romantic here. He wanted to build, he kind of liked settled high culture. And this is something that even though he's a warlord, there's no, a way around that. I mean, most of his memoir is about being a warlord. He is always trying to kind of find a place to rule. He's trying to set up roots, set up a court somewhere, and and rule. Um, so yes, on the one hand, he's an imperialist and he's a warlord, but he is not, um, let's say, doing it for no purpose, or kind of just a destructive conqueror. he is always looking for a place to rule. Now, the problem and kind of the dramatic tension that works itself out in the Baburnama is the fact that he is um, a never really not never really successful. He's always having problems. His ancestors ruled Samarkand, one of the great oasis cities of the Central Asia. One of those so-called, on the so-called Silk Roads. And he's kicked out 3 times by the Shaibanids. He goes back and forth. He's always trying to rule it. And, when he captures Samarkand, there's always, he's kind of thinks there's a sort of sense of relief that finally he can rule this city and, and have a court and have this kind of high, develop this sort of high courtly culture. But he's ultimately unsuccessful. And then when he goes to Afghanistan, and he is in Afghanistan for some time, he encounters the same problem. He cannot really, establish a permanent rule there. He says that it's basically not fit to be ruled in some ways, right? And he doesn't really become a figure of South Asian history until very late in his life. So that's why, when I was reading it, I thought, this is really more of a Central Asian story in many ways, both because of the language he uses. He writes in Turkey and Chagatai, and so makes the book really a serious example of Chagatai literature. But also, from what I understand of the Chagatai text, he's not, let's say, he doesn't write with a very courtly, complex style. If you're familiar with like Insha style in Persian or something like that, or Arabic perhaps, you would maybe know what I'm talking about. But the kind of use of a lot of rhyme prose, very flowery metaphor, and this sort of thing. Babur writes fairly directly. It really is like just his thoughts and what he did. Although he did write verse as well, so he did have that kind of inclination. But the Baburnama is not, a kind of insha work itself or something like that. And I think Babur, if you read his story carefully, you'll kind of see the problems with thinking like the popular misreadings, for example, of Ibn Khaldun, or the kind of superficial readings of like someone like Ibn Khaldun. Babur, as I said, he wants a kind of settled court. You don't get the impression, while family is quite important, these kind of family clan sort of lineages are important, you don't get the sense in his narrative that that's like the end all, that's sort of the purpose of existence is just this kind of tribal society. And in fact, he's even quite critical of that sort of purely kind of malicious sort of nomadry, as opposed to like just pastoralism, in general. Obviously, in Central Asia historically, and even to the present, the pastoralists play an important role. But Babur is conducting, warfare for some kind of purpose to achieve some kind of civilization. That's not to sanitize necessarily some of the things we might find less savory, but there is a framework he's operating in. He's not a kind of land pirate that's just going about for no reason, and he is kind of also shows the problems with this understanding of asabiya, of solidarity, um, because Babur, he really struggles to keep followers at some point, especially when he gets to India itself. A lot of his closest confidants say, they cannot handle this and they want to go back to Afghanistan. And he says, okay, go ahead, I go, fine. Um, so there's really not a lot of solidarity, and this is where I think his perspective is important because it's all too easy to, as an outsider of a group, to kind of project that this people I'm facing, they must have this kind of great, solidarity that will overpower us decadent people, um, and I think Bob Orr shows that what it's like to be on the other side of that, where his army, his kind of court in the field, if you will, as he's sort of traveling, they don't really have a lot of that solidarity all the time. I mean, it does happen. Obviously, he has military successes, but it's not this kind of uh, field that envelops them or something. Um, so when we think about Babur, you know, he is the kind of last Timurid, and I think that's really why he and his descendants are so successful long term. Now, Babur himself, when he reaches India, he's not there very long, only a few years, but I think he had instilled enough in his son Humayun uh, that the purpose was to establish a court, establish a higher kind of culture overseen by the Sultan, of course, uh, and not just this sort of path of destruction. And Timur did carve a path of destruction, but there was a kind of kernel of wanting to, um, create a high culture. And Timur's direct descendants, so people like Ulugh Beg, Shahrukh, did, try to develop a high culture. Um, and in their cases, it was the kind of tribal solidarity that did exist among certain clans in the Timurid system that worked against them because, um, the clans just wanted to stick together. It wasn't really conducive to setting up a kind of administration of some sort. Because it's one thing to conquer all this territory, conquer a bunch of territory, um, and then it's entirely another to okay, now we have to actually administer this. What do we do with it? And for example, the Ottomans had answers to that of, well, okay, we need to create a bureaucracy. We will have a legal system that ensures that there is a legal framework that's consistent across our territory, or as much as that was possible for them, um, to build basically have a functioning society. And so I think when we look at the Mughals, that Timurid legacy uh, did influence them, and they had the kind of knowledge to not just conquer, North India militarily, but also had the understanding of, what are we actually trying to do here? Babur, for example, is seen as like this, by some, is seen as like this kind of wanting to develop like a kind of jihad state, or establish this kind of strict religious state. And reading his memoir, he really does not invoke that. It comes at the end in one of the battles. He fights with the Rajputs, but nowhere else does he ever invoke this, even against other um, even against other kind of groups, and the Ottomans did invoke their identity as like a Ghazi, as a holy warrior, fighting the Safavids, fighting other Muslims, or Shia Muslims, but still in the same religion, nevertheless. But Babur does not really do that. He's not. He's an imperialist, both the kind of good, well, kind of with the positives and negatives that come with that in this period. So, was he a kind of theocrat or something like that? Not really, not really at all. I don't think, based on reading his text. And certainly, he does have a kind of affinity for the Naqshbandi Sufi order, and he is fairly, he is kind of have piety, but it's not a kind of nothing unique. And I think the leading into another point is I think the other reason why the Baburnama is perhaps more so a Central Asian work is the fact that Babur is mostly concerned with the affairs and kind of the Game of Thrones, if you will, with other Muslims. There's no Christians that appear in the narrative, as far as I don't think. And the other people he was encountering for the most part were Muslims. I mean, unless maybe there's some Nestorian Christians or something, I don't know, but that were living in Bukhara perhaps, but I don't think so. And that's kind of also an interesting reason to a good reason, I should say, to read the Baburnama, because you can see a kind of perspective on Islamic history that doesn't really involve Europe. What was it like to be in this kind of region of the world, Central Asia, Iran, North India, where you really have no kind of engagement with the West or the Christian world, however you'd like to determine it. And I think that's also valuable. Another reason to read it. I think it's easy to define or understand Islamic history as a kind of duality with the Christian world, and there's reasons for that. It's not totally baseless, but that's really not the whole kind of tapestry. It's kind of a tangent, but I remember in one course I had to write. I was writing a paper on Byzantine history, so I was going to write something about the frontier with the Abbasids, or the Umayyads, and later the Abbasids. And when I sat down to read Tabari's history, there's really not much in Tabari's history about the Byzantine world. I mean, he kind of talks about there being raids, this sort of thing that kind of get launched, but it's not like with great detail. And of course, that's just one source, but that was something that I think is kind of obvious in some ways, like obviously they're not totally preoccupied with this, Western question, if you want to put it that way, but they are have a completely different perspective on the inside, and you're probably from that part of the world even today, it's probably pretty obvious, right? But this is not the kind of framing that it's generally given in the United States or Europe typically. And so Babur is giving you a completely different perspective on this part of the world, these civilizations, um, and the kind of different manifestations that the Islamic world takes on, especially in Central Asia. Babur has a lot of relationship with the Naqshbandi Sufis, as I previously mentioned. He is uh, has a different conception of piety than I think even perhaps like more uh, Muslims in a place like Cairo or uh, Damascus, these kind of that were major centers of Islamic learning and kind of the more um, legalistic, perhaps, or scholastic manifestations of it that happened there. He has a much different perspective on things. Um, and lastly, I think just my final point. I mean, there's a lot I could say about Babur and the Baburnama, but um, it's just also a very nice read. It's not the kind of book that is or text that's like very overly difficult, um, and maybe and maybe the fact that it is not very difficult, it kind of makes it deceptive in a way because there's a lot of things you can pull out of it, and if you read carefully and kind of really see how Babur was thinking. Um, but it is not a very. But if you just wanted to sit and read it, it's just a story of his life. It's what he did and the people he encountered, and you get probably one of the most raw and um, highly personal, kind of self narratives in anywhere, let's say pre 1800, perhaps. I think the thing that would probably surpass it, at least for me, would maybe be the Confessions of Saint Augustine. But Saint Augustine had a kind of different reason for writing and a different emphasis. Um, but uh, I think for Babur's time and place, his narrative is just fantastic. And the second Safavid Shah Tahmasp, did write a sort of autobiography. It recently came out in translation by Andrew Peacock, but that is not. I read it and it sort of lacks the kind of uh, just the texture that Babur brings. Babur, he brings so many like just funny anecdotes that you would sort of expect. He's like a going on these like campaigns and stuff, but like he talks about, he goes for a swim in the Ganges, I think, and then like a week later he says, I got sick, and or he talks about how he ate something and he got very sick, um, and he talks about, oh, I got sick, and these kind of seem like um, mundane details, and they are, but it shows that he was a real person. He had like these kind of everyday problems, and he was also sort of honest and brave enough to write them down too. That he ate bad food and he got sick, or one of the few kind of sexual things in the book, which is not really graphic or anything, is he's drinking with some of his friends, and this woman comes to the camp, and they say, well, is this permitted? And he says, and I think he says, yeah, okay, let her come and drink, and um, and later she tries to like basically proposition him, and then he pretends to sleep to kind of get her away. But all this to say, you get the sense that of a real person is behind this. It's not kind of shrouded in uh, a kind of a high literary style, or trying to conceal things in a by a later historian. Um, and not to say that that's even like kind of means that other chronicles are like false or something. It's just it's a different mode of writing when these authors, especially from this period, sat down to write history, what the way they were thinking, and Babur writes very personally. So uh, I think that's more or less my reflections. I'll probably return to the Baburnama a lot and talk about it. But these are sort of my reflections. If you want to read it, there's the translation by Wheeler Thaxton. You can buy, the copy, for example, I have here. I think there's one or two. There's an illustrated edition based on one of the later Persian manuscripts of it. And there's also the Annette Beveridge translation, which is in the public domain. I find that while the Thaxton translation is more kind of literary and kind of more engaging to read sometimes, Beveridge was a very fastidious and careful translator. So, if you want kind of to get a feel of the kind of register and diction of the Chagatai original, she was quite good, which is impressive given that, I think she was probably one of the few people in the world at that time to be translating Chagatai into English, and she did it with, very little kind of resources. Um, so that's my kind of reflections on the Baburnama. A kind of monument of Central Asian literature. And I hope you found this interesting, and I encourage you to read the Baburnama. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.